Recorded, and without further ado, Lucy, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for all attending today, and thanks for those online also attending. It's good to be back at TSU celebrating the 50th anniversary. As part of this Transport and Health Research Network, I am working on a project at the moment looking at experiences of harassment to women and people identifying as women in buses specifically. So I'm not going to speak specifically about that project today, partly because we haven't got data. I hope that we'd have a lot more data coming in that I could share with you. But without that, so I'm going to do a kind of an overview really. Basically incorporating hate and hate crime along with harassment as well. So not just looking at women's experiences, but also other marginalised groups' experiences. So harassment and experience in everyday mobility and transport. So such as kind of conceptualising public transport safe space and spaces where we're moving as part of our everyday mobility as spaces for hate. That doesn't sound very nice or very positive. But hopefully in recognising and acknowledging and understanding, we can move towards kind of safer spaces in everyday mobility. So looking at who's particularly affected by harassment and how do intersecting identities and oppressive structures relate to the different experiences of harassment, looking at relational approaches to conceptualise and locate context-specific experiences of harassment, and really looking at what responses there are at the moment to public harassment and what we might be doing in the future, and what kind of research is coming up in the next few years that can contribute to those changes. So I want to start a little bit back to front. So this kind of is a response to everyday kind of experiences of harassment, looking at legal narratives in the criminal justice system. And forgive me, this is going to be a bit UK centric based on the kind of literature that I'm reading at the moment where my research is based. But this came to my attention over a Christmas dinner. I was speaking to my brother and we were talking about what is the research project about, what am I doing these days? I said I'm looking into harassment and sexual harassment that women are experiencing on bus commutes. And he said, okay, well, what's harassment? What are you kind of looking at? What behaviours are you looking at? And I explained a few of them, like being touched inappropriately or having men kind of invade your space, sit too closely next to you, making you uncomfortable, having intrusive kind of conversations that can escalate into something more aggressive, and so forth. And he said, Lucy, no, that's not harassment. And he went through the various kind of legal frameworks that we've got. And he kind of explained to me that harassment is more to do with a kind of a repeated occurrence, conduct over time. So by one individual or a group of individuals, that you're harassing one individual over a period of time repeatedly. And that's under the Public Harassment Act. And then he mentioned that there was the Public Order Act. He didn't go into this much detail over Christmas dinner, by the way. But it's within the Public Order Act, harassment is there, but it's the lower level kind of incidents that generally aren't kind of looked into or investigated. So it's threatening, abusive or insulting words or behaviours, writing or visual representation that causes harassment, alarm or distress to that person once it's inflicted. And so we also have the Equality Act, where harassment is illegal, and it's defined as unwanted conduct which is related to relevant protected characteristics, has the purpose or effect of creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating or offensive environment for the complaint or of violating the complainant's dignity. But with the Equality Act, that tends to be used where people may make complaints, and that will result in a court procedure where that person may be sued based on that kind of harassment behaviour that they've inflicted on someone else. And that kind of works in terms of dealing with work-based harassment, but not so much in terms of one member of the public harassing another member of the public. And so where there's clear kind of a loophole or a gap in the legal framework in the UK, at least and elsewhere, is around sexual harassment. And this is very gendered. So women are subjected far more to sexual harassment across the world. It's the same everywhere, most commonly by male perpetrators. And in generally, it's so much so that it's accepted among feminist geographers as a means through which men control public space and women's behaviour, with the effect of maintaining their oppressive position within patriarchal societies. And going back to the Equality Act, sexual harassment is unlawful in England and Wales, defined pretty much as the same as harassment, but with a conduct of sexual nature. But again, that won't result if you make a complaint to the police. That's not a kind of legal framework which could then lead to a conviction of sexual harassment. So many of the sexual behaviours that constitute those understandings of harassment are not criminal behaviours in the UK law, unless one of the behaviours is acknowledged under the Sexual Offences Act, which is another piece of legislation. Sorry if I'm losing this one. But it criminalises higher level sexual offences, some of which also fit into common understandings by the public and various stakeholders of what constitutes sexual harassment. And those might include sexual assault, exposure of people of their genitals, voyeurism, upskirting, which is taking pictures beneath someone's clothing without their consent or knowledge, and also rape is a serious sexual offence, which is also considered by some people to be sexual harassment, although I'm not sure I would actually agree with that. So there's this definition, which was given by Nia Mellows, the Chief of British Transport Police, in a presentation that she gave with the Land O'Lynx Gender on Gender seminar series back in November 2022. And she was in conversation, and she said that the British Transport Police decided that they were going to define sexual harassment to acknowledge its extent, the scope of which it is occurring against women, and that there was a legal kind of gap there, that women weren't covered and weren't protected by the law in regards to many of the sexual harassment behaviours that are considered kind of lower level. So they define it now as any behaviours that are perpetrated against victims which are sexually motivated or have a sexual element but don't quite reach the threshold of existing legislation under the Sexual Offences Act. And one of the reasons Nia was saying in this discussion was that they wanted to raise awareness of various harassment behaviours. But I find that an interesting kind of definition to use. Actually, it's not particularly useful in raising awareness of what constitutes sexual harassment unless you're aware of the Sexual Offences Act. But they do manage to encourage reporting of lower level sexual harassment behaviours in public transport. Actually, particularly in the rails, the British Transport Police don't cover buses at all, to encourage reporting and to collect data on incidents that happen. She mentioned that there's a kind of a triage system when people phone in to make complaints to report sexual harassment, where at a minimum level those people are thanked for reporting an incident, but it doesn't necessarily lead to a criminal investigation or a court prosecution, whereas the high level cases tend to be investigated. So at the moment, the British Transport Police and the police, their hands are tied in terms of what they can do. So this is a major kind of limitation in the criminal justice system and the punitive kind of approaches around dealing with sexual harassment. So in order to kind of overcome these issues, the UK government is pursuing a legislative change to the Public Order Act, whereby they are introducing a new offence. They're considering it at the moment. But harassment is intended because of a person's sex or perceived sex. Whereas the Scottish government are considering adding a new offence of public misogynistic harassment, specifically against women. And across the world, sexual harassment is illegal at the moment in Portugal, Buenos Aires, Manila, Egypt, and in Belgium, sexist abuse in the street is now criminalised. And just to confuse things a bit more, there's kind of a term going around, and it has been for a long time actually, of street harassment, which is used sometimes interchangeably to describe sexual harassment of women. Sexual harassment began to be used by feminists a while ago to give a name to the sexual harassment women experience on the street. And it now appears in policy, and in the case of Peru, as a national law criminalising street harassment. In the UK, government now acknowledged street harassment as a form of gender-based violence in its refreshed violence against women and girls strategy. So within the concept of street harassment, incidents described various sexual behaviours, but the sexual element isn't really explicit in the terminology in its name. Although the reference to the street as a place where harassment and women usually occurs was considered significant by those who kind of started to use it. It differentiates the kind of harassment that occurs in public as opposed to the kind of harassment that occurs in the workplace. Women have had more protections because of those legal frameworks such as the Equality Act, where you could take an employer to court, for example, if you complained that that's a case of sexual harassment. So the definition that Fireborn and O'Neill gives is that street harassment constitutes a broad array of behaviour. In the research today, there is considerable slippage and ambiguity in terms of what actions count as street harassment. The most common approach positions street harassment as a form of sexual harassment that is overwhelmingly perpetrated by male strangers against women in the public place. And while it's commonly framed as sexualized in nature, it can manifest in ways that are racist, homophobic, transphobic, ableist, Islamophobic, and so forth. But the term doesn't acknowledge that most harassment against women and the behaviours described as sexual, or the emotional impact that has on women who are objectified, or the full range of places where it occurs, which is also in nightclubs, bars, and universities, for instance. And even more positively, the term's recently been used to acknowledge the experiences of harassment that occur at the intersection of multiple oppressive structures, characteristics, and identities to recognise that other forms of hate that women experience other than and with misogyny. But the concern I have is that without intersect characteristics being distinguished as aggravating instances of street harassment, it's unclear how the term or any future law against street harassment would be more helpful than that's already existing and acknowledging and reporting misogyny or gender sexual harassment as it intersects with race, religion, ethnicity, disability, or sexuality, unless used in conjunction with hate crime, which I'll go into next. So I think there's still a debate around the use of this term. Hannah Mason-Bish and Irene Zimp also using the term street harassment to be more open, to be more inclusive, to capture the different forms of harassment that women experience in public. So it's not just sexual harassment, but it also can be relating to other intersecting identities that they have. So yeah, it's kind of like, is that kind of open term better for being more inclusive, or does it risk kind of those identities and the kind of experiences that people have, where women have, not only because of their sex or their gender, but also because of their race, their religion, and so forth? Or would it be better or more useful to have, as we'll see with the hate crime legislation framework, to be able to kind of distinguish those different kind of instances or reasons why perpetrators act on different types of people? So basically, to introduce the hate crime, at the moment in the UK and I believe in the US, it's not too dissimilar. I wanted to include hate and hate crime within this presentation, just to look at the different kind of offences that people experience on the basis of different identities that they have and how the law kind of responds to that. So at the moment, it's any criminal offence which is perceived by the victim or any other person to be motivated by hostility or prejudice based on a person's race, religion, sexual orientation, disability, or any crime motivated by hostility or prejudice against a person who is transgender or perceived to be transgender. And the kind of, it's how a person's identity is being perceived by the perpetrator, but it's important here. And how the victim kind of feels, if they feel that that was an incident that was motivated by hate or not. And the police do recognise that not all hate crimes or hate incidents amount to a criminal offence. And again, it goes back to what behaviours do count as being criminal and which ones are not. But they do consider it equally important to report and record all of these crimes that have been reported or incidents as hate incidents, if they're lower level kind of harassment behaviours. But in the academic kind of work around hate crime, hate is defined as acts of violence, hostility, and intimidation directed towards people because of their identity or perceived difference. Or another one is a belief system that enables a more powerful group to demonstrate their dominance to a subordinate others. So here we don't have the criminal offence, which the criminal justice system have to imply. You can only have a hate crime kind of recognised if it is already a criminal offence. So it's not a crime in itself, but it's an add-on to an already existing offence. And here we have some limitations and some omissions. So people of different ages are not recognised within the hate crime law. So offences against older people. So it might be a common one is older people are more kind of victimised by robbery incidents. So it's partly because of their inability to kind of respond to those incidents that they're perceived as being weaker, but they tend to be victims of robbery kind of crimes on the street. But actually, because of this kind of normalisation about what should count within the hate crime framework, for example, older people's harassment against them because of their age is not recognised or acknowledged within this legal framework. And again, neither was women's. So women's experiences generally and women's intersecting experiences are completely absent from a hate crime legislation. Misogyny has been kind of considered, and there was a report and a consultation that happened recently looking into should misogyny be included here to recognise the kind of harassment and hate that women face within patriarchal societies on the street or in public or in other public spaces. But actually it was decided that misogyny or gender or sex should not be added here, but it didn't fit into this legal framework. And it's partly because gender is already included as transgender, so there's a difficulty around including gender here. So I thought, what about including sex here? But actually, so certainly misogyny wasn't fitting in because it didn't fit in with, for example, racism isn't there, but it's a person's race or perceived race. And there was some pushback by women's support campaigning groups and advocates to end domestic violence and violence against women. But actually, it was going to be very difficult to kind of prove hate as an aggravating factor. So hatred toward women, misogynistic behaviour is determining domestic violence. And there's a lot of work that's being done around domestic violence, and it almost kind of is a dominant sort of way that we have seen until more recently, perhaps looking at violence against women, and it's perpetrated mostly within that domestic sphere that doesn't take into account the kind of violence that women are subjected to day to day with a lower level kind of sexual harassment behaviours. And responses towards harassment or violence, what constitutes violence, are changing, is in flux. It's all socially constructed. And you will see recently that how we're thinking about violence against women, what kind of behaviours constitute that, they are changing. And it's the kind of lower level day-to-day things that people face that individually don't really add up to much, but are now kind of conceptualised as being more kind of acts of violence. So, you know, what constitutes harassment now? Within academic studies, everyday lived experience is kind of fairly well documented. So I've listed just a few of the kind of behaviours that people report having experienced in their own interpretation that they felt harassed. But I just wanted to give you a few examples from some of the studies that are existing. So I'll start with Amy Luberton and others' 2017 paper on transgender people's experiences in public transport. A white male was being extremely rude and saying very, very transphobic things straight to my face. And I immediately reported him to the bus driver. And the bus driver looked at me like, did he say something wrong? The specific term the other passenger used was, why don't you tuck it in then? For the record. I'm like, great, thanks. Looked at the bus driver, and the bus driver just didn't understand why that would be so offensive. Tegan's experience highlights how comments made by another passenger can have a heightened impact when transit staff fail to respond in a supportive manner to the author's comments. In this example, the transport space and the normative practices bus driver follows denies passengers right to travel free of harm, which may be passive ignorance or active discrimination, but creates relation in the space of exclusion and hate for transgender women. From criminologist David Wilkins' 2020 book, Disability, Hate Crime Experiences of Hostility in Public Transport. Participant recalls, he moved to the middle of the seat. I asked him to move. He completely ignored me. I asked again. He opened his legs to prevent me sitting on and called me a stranger. Why? What have I done to upset him? Hate against disabled people can be legitimated by perpetrators on the basis that they receive benefits and do not deserve to, as perceived by the perpetrator, or should live in reduced circumstances while them because they receive welfare benefits. And commonly, these are comments received when disabled people claim their right to priority seating. And another one from Fiona Deere of Braysburg. The book's called The Right Amount of Panic, How Women Trade Freedom for Safety. Female participant highlights how patriarchy operates in space through the perpetuation of sexual harassment and men's intrusions. Sometimes I can feel like the streets really are my own to walk into, you know? Like there's these men on them, and they own it, and I'm only welcome if I accept that I'm going to be spoken to, and they have the right to do that and to make comments. So looking now at who is most at risk of experiencing harassment or hate crime. I'm going to touch on intersecting characteristics in the next slide, but just to give some examples of who is most at risk and feels less secure in the scale of some of the incidents. So disabled people, particularly subjected to harassment, and women also. So for example, in the UK, 84% of women report having experienced sexual harassment in their lifetime, including sexual assault or violence. According to the ONS data in the UK, non-white people are more likely to experience sexual harassment. 17% of disabled people compared with 10% of non-disabled people experience sexual harassment compared to non-disabled people. And there's no disaggregation by gender or sexuality to report on the same data set from the ONS on LGBTQ plus people's safety. Deprivation also affects people's safety perceptions. And for example, travelling into and from places with middle to high deprivation. Non-white ethnicities experience harassment more so than white people in the UK. Just 12% of harassment reports being shouted at or verbally insulted in the past year, whereas 24 people identifying as mixed or multiple ethnicity report this, and Asians represent 15% of those, and Black people representing 10% of reporting experiencing this kind of harassment in public. Harassment is experienced through and as a result of multiple identities that can have a greater impact on individuals and groups because of multiple strands of oppression structuring their socioeconomic positions and inclusion in society. Looking at intersectionality as an approach to consider hate crime and harassment or the experiences that women have in relation to harassment, it enables us to consider how the multiple and simultaneous effects of different systems of operation, such as race, class, gender, and sexuality, interact, and victims experience perpetrator motivation and exclusion. So I've divided this slide content into kind of three sections to try and organise how the multiple forms of oppression result in different experiences for different identified characteristics or combinations. So it's more than just like a double or triple disadvantage. It's also about very specific kind of experiences that different people have, specifically within the context of public transport or everyday mobility. So class is intersecting with race, ethnicity, and gender. So, for example, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, more exposed to harassment and violence, and have higher vulnerability. They're more dependent on using public transport and therefore spend more time in public transport and are more likely to be exposed to harassment than those in more privileged economic positions. And that also includes being a witness to incidents such as they have fewer alternatives to get around by private car or by taxi, even though they may be fearful of travelling in public transport and may limit their mobility as a result. They may be more likely to live in places where there are high rates of crime. One study of Black women's experience in America reports that women were spending more time in parks where criminally employed men and unemployed people were also spending their time. So it's kind of about the additional exposure that women have in contexts where they're more likely to be harassed. I say women, but it applies to men as well with intersecting identities. Looking at people's experience of harassment and hostility differs with the intersection of various forms of hate and its oppression, its operation of oppression. So gender misogyny, as it works to structure a patriarchal society, is often, though not always, at work in intersection of experiences of harassment. So, for example, looking at the work of Hannah Mason-Fish and Irene Sempe again, they report that while wearing the niqab, Muslim women are punished by white, usually male harassers for not conforming to Western expectations of how gender is performed in such a way that objectifies women for a male gaze through which the niqab, the veil, becomes an object that manifests in a particular form of racist and misogynistic abuse. For example, one participant in that 2022 UK study received this abuse. Why do you have a mask? Are you really ugly into men? And others had their veil stripped from them, which left them feeling sexually violated. Much of the literature on intersectional experiences of harassment demonstrate that hostility toward a feminine identity and to non-conforming sexualities and/or genders. For example, harassment of transgender women is thought to be occurring more frequently than for transgender men because of misogyny and transphobia acting at one time, demonstrated, for example, by trans men talking with passing as men and therefore no longer experiencing the harassment that they did as women, and of trans women not passing as women in their gender non-conformity. Or the transition is visible and therefore is subjected to trans hate crime. The term transmisogyny has been used to describe the transphobia that women experience as they deviate from the expected gender norms dictated by cis-normative expectations, and misogyny resulting from embodying or perceived embodying femininity considered to be less than in patriarchal societies. Gay men also experience a greater level of harassment than straight men because of the same hostility towards the feminine gender they sometimes exhibit, as well as their minority sexuality. Lesbians can experience homophobia and misogyny simultaneously, and are therefore at more risk of being sexually harassed, specifically while showing affection in public with a same-sex partner or demonstrating social cues for the group. Experience of oppression and prior experience of discrimination and harassment, and people feeling like they're different and do not belong, can affect how marginalised people feel when travelling. Sometimes they're more fearful than others, often related to identities that are others, and this can manifest more so in certain spaces to have the effect of people feeling other and excluded. People's feelings of harassment differ because of the social norms that correspond with their identities. For example, the narrative of lesbians focuses on self-sufficiency. It can be viewed in light of gender norms that encourage women to endure hardship in a stoic manner, rather than seeking support after an incident. And gay men's repeated emphasis on strength is understood in the context of gendered expectations and social mechanisms that encourage men to perform masculinity through strength. So both of which discourage those groups of people from reporting and discussing problem and experience of harassment and hate. People also feel social pressures arising from the social norms into different religions and ethnicities. For example, lesbian and gay people of colour describe feeling pressure on themselves to live to expectations around both sexual and gender norms and to confine themselves to hetero and feminine masculine binaries. And in the example of misogyny and Islamophobia against field women have difficult conflicting concerns whether or not to remove their veil in order to make their religious identity less visible and to protect themselves, which would be in conflict with their individual and community or family desires and expectations to practice their religion in a certain way. In relating to disabled people's experiences, someone who's female and disabled may feel a particular vulnerability when confronted with strangers in public. Disabled women are particularly more susceptible to harassment, particularly those with learning disabilities. They're less able to remove themselves from harassers or to report it, and because impairments can often easily be read, not always, by others through the use of assistive support such as walking sticks and wheelchairs, they're more visible and therefore more at risk of experiencing hate crime because of disability. And disabled people of colour may be less forthcoming in seeking assistance while having experienced previous forms of discrimination, for example, when reporting crimes to the police. And in relation to the hate crime law that I described earlier, organising hate crime into the complex kind of protected characteristics defined by criminal justice policy, critiques argue that it neglects the complex and intersectional nature of hate crime. For example, McDonald has now found that defining a particular type of hate as either racist, homophobic, or transphobic motivated crime often masks the fact that many of these victims may also be disabled people. They state if a disabled person was from an ethnic minority group, then the nature of the hate would often be conceptualized as race rather than disability. It oversimplifies the nature of the problem for disabled people and it renders them visible. And another point on the experience of disabled people is that they simultaneously commonly experiencing exclusion and accessibility in public spaces, moving through and accessing public spaces. And that exacerbates the impact of harassment that they experience in terms of limiting their mobility as a result of both harassment and accessibility issues. So finally, there's a need to understand the hardships and experiences people who are oppressed already experiencing and not related to experiencing harassment in the public. For example, that many people of minority ethnicity who are of colour or who are gay, transgender or disabled are not well represented in public institutions or consultation and fare less well in their experience of the criminal justice system and less confident to seek support or to report an incident. So harassment tends to add to existing experiences that are negatively impacting on those who are more at risk of being exposed to harassment. It's really important to be aware of the interaction of intersecting forms of oppression and identity within responses to harassment. We need to ensure that we are understanding who is most at risk and this differs on why. What people's differing experiences are likely to make to interventions to make sure that they're inclusive. And within transportation and public space, and that is also inclusive. And these things are in flux to some extent depending on current policies and representations, so it ought to be included as a continual part of it. In terms of impacts of hate crime that it has on individuals and people's behaviour, I've listed some of the kind of safety work as defined by some that women kind of withdraw from in public space by removing themselves from eye contact, not sitting next to men, choosing to sit next to women or next to a bus driver. People make themselves inconspicuous, they choose to blend in with the expectation of what's normal. For example, A visually impaired person might choose not to use their white gel in certain spaces. Transgender people, lesbians and gay men may hide their gender or their sexuality and form different characteristics to make themselves feel safer and secure while out in public. Women may stay closer to home and avoid areas where there are few people of their religion or ethnicity, for example. So there are many kind of ways in which people change their behaviour in order to kind of reduce instances and potential instances and the threats of receiving hate or harassment in public. And the effect of that is, within the literature in various studies, is negative psychological and emotional consequences. You know, you've got fear, anger, distrust, depression, stress, sleeping disorders, anxiety, self-objectification that leads to kind of feelings of shame and body surveillance, anxiety out in public. Logan kind of argues that harassment induces a fear of more serious harm, including rape and murder. Often when women are being harassed, they actually are fearing that the incident might escalate into something more serious like rape. David Wilkins' study of hate crime in public transport found among his disabled participants over half felt isolated as a result of those incidents and had adapted their lifestyle as a result. 67% report feeling like they couldn't use public transport in the future. And this is somebody's sort of feeling, having experienced hate crime and disabled person from David Wilkins' study. I've been followed back home by two guys who'd already abused me on the bus. They live nearby. I know who they are. And the fact that they live so close makes me weep. Actually, I cry all the time, or at least it feels like it. I get my groceries delivered. They said that they were going to smash my windows if I reported anything, so I haven't. It's terrifying. What am I supposed to do? I mean, this demonstrates the kind of stress that this person is under, not just once, but all the time. The feeling of being alone and we can't do anything about it. Constant level of stress, anticipating abuse is how one trans person describes their everyday mobility and steady life. Ryan Tropital, and in the results, and the impact of this is that people are reducing and limiting their mobility and don't take part in social activities, society, economic activities, and end up not completely, but more marginalised than others. So thinking about concepts and theories in terms of studying hate and harassment that are relevant to looking at transport, spaces and mobility. Landscapes of hate is a term that's being used, and there's a good book at the moment for landscapes of hate. But thinking about it relationally, it's making the connection that hate operates in everyday spaces. It's a kind of everyday occurrence that's perpetrated by fairly ordinary people, and not necessarily because of hostility towards their identity or their perceived ambiguity, but also because of the situations within which individuals are targeted. So geographers working relationally contextualise the incidents and kind of look at the particular spaces, what kind of effect those spaces have in sort of developing, producing hate and harassment, which is mediated through very specific local geographies. But it's also more widely kind of shaped by representations in media, national policies, and legal frameworks. So it's not only in space, but it relates to a whole kind of assemblage of various other sort of representations that change. And then if they change at one point, you might see there's more kind of transphobic commentary in certain newspapers at the moment, and then transgender people are receiving more abuse and hate in the street and in public. Iona Data and Nabila Ahmed are the internet infrastructures, and they give examples of a lack of lighting around toilets in India. And what that means for women is that they avoid using toilets and they end up with urinary tract infections. So they term this an intimate kind of violence, which is embodied in urban and digital infrastructures and socio-political context, in which these are produced and experienced by women. Another example within their study was actually there was a presence of street lighting, but actually men were kind of gathering under the light space and led to women feeling more unsafe. But it's basically like looking infrastructurally in the urban kind of context, at how spaces produce misogyny against women specifically, by looking at gender. And again, looking at gender in the data conceptualizes the genderscapes of hate, which are maintained through a steady flow of violence directed at women over their life course and their everyday life within spaces. These kind of fluid spaces that are produced by perceptions, performances, and portrayals of gender, through ordinary and everyday kind of extraordinary incidents. Okay, sorry. But yeah, it's basically looking relationally, so like how hate kind of is produced within certain spaces. So, for example, in public transport space, it would be kind of confined, crowded carriages. It would be people kind of passing through funnels and gates. It would be unsteady kind of environments where incidents can go unnoticed, or people have an excuse that actually the carriage moved, or there's a pothole in the road. So it's very kind of specific spaces relating to public transport mobilities, and how that kind of produces instances or excuses for harassment and hate within those kind of structurally oppressive societies, such as patriarchy or racial kind of discrimination. So we haven't really had time to kind of consider responses, but we've got various interventions. CCTV is very commonly kind of cited as being an intervention around improving people's safety and security on public transport and in the cities. But again, it's very much up to debate if it actually makes people feel more secure or is useful in kind of detecting and evidencing cases of like verbal conversations that constitute harassment. There are many, but it's basically what I want to say in the next kind of stages of thinking about our response to incidents of public harassment is looking at, with this kind of relational concept, very specific and local spaces, is how we're embedding responses within communities, how we engage with people to come and to kind of talk about what interventions might work for them, bringing in different stakeholders, like how do we work with transport companies and the public to kind of produce a response to this that might work? How do we change people's behaviours that relate more widely to like the symbolic nature of the law, for example, by ensuring that women are kind of recognised and acknowledged within legal frameworks, and what kind of symbolic effect that might have on our behaviour, while we might not be able to police all of these new criminal behaviours that might be added to resource limitations. But I mean, it's kind of like Louise Pedersen mentions the foundational approach. It's building community coalitions between different social groups as well. So part of it's sort of building on restorative justice approaches and looking at getting people talking within communities, potentially getting perpetrators talking with victims, but that also kind of has issues in terms of do people want to have that kind of relationship with a perpetrator or not. It involves ensuring more women in public transport and within those kind of positions where they might be able to kind of affect change, ensuring data is collected about harassment cases as marginalised groups. Yeah, I'm gonna conclude that. We're basically like doing research around how that would work. And evaluation studies as well, very, very limited. So there's almost no evaluation studies of what interventions work to make spaces safer and make people feel more secure and reduce cases of harassment. Okay, thank you very much for listening.